Alright, welcome to the lesson on gender. Notice I've got a little title here, Why Men Are Not From Mars and Women Are Not From Venus. And this really is going to relate right here to one of the most important ideas that we get, and that is that two things that you may have heard of or assumed they were the same thing aren't. So oftentimes you'll see these variables used, which are sex and gender. So people will say, what's your sex, what's your gender? And oftentimes in the sort of the real world, people are using them interchangeably. In the sociological world, and not that this, of course, is not a real world, but in the more scientific world here, we actually see these as two different variables. So sex, by the way, is biological, so it's related to our ascribed status. That is, the statuses that are given to us that we have no choice over. So when we look at sex, we're talking about what we're born with. That is, are you male or are you female? When we're talking about gender, we're actually talking about the characteristics that society considers proper for males and females. So, for example, masculine and feminine. So, masculine was assumed to go along with male, feminine was assumed to go along with female, and the reason that is the case, and this is what sociologists will talk about, the reason it's the case is because this is what we've been trained to be. And that is, if you're a boy, there's certain expectations. If you're a girl, there's certain expectations, and they start on you very young. So, I mean, even think about it going back to when someone's about to have a child. You know, what the people always ask is, well, what's the sex of the child? Because they make their purchasing decisions based upon the sex of the child. So if people are shopping for a child, for a shower or whatever, they'll blue for boys, pink for girls, and of course if you don't know, or if they don't know, people go with those neutral colors like a green or something, because we're already sending out these gendered messages. That is, what's appropriate for you as a male, you should be into these things. What's appropriate for you as a female? And of course we do this through people's lives. Certainly with children, we do it when we start looking at what's expected of you. And, we do it with, for example, the toys that we provide children. Oftentimes we encourage girls to have dolls, and we encourage boys to have trucks and those sort of things. So they're not exactly the same thing, although people oftentimes use them interchangeably. One thing that we see when we talk about gender is that the reason that this is such an issue is that societies are not divided evenly as far as the distribution of power. So throughout the world, what we see, and this is in all societies that we can tell, is that men have more power than women. Now, don't be confused by this. This doesn't mean that there's not cases where women might not have more power. For example, someone who's a queen, or even someone may have more power in their individual household. What we mean is, as a group, men are a dominant group. They have more power than women. And so that notion of men having more power is this idea of patriarchy. So patriarchy just means that men have more power. A matriarchy would be a society, and kind of theoretical really, a society where women as a group have more power. So don't make the mistake of thinking, well, I know this woman has a lot more power than this guy. And we're talking about as a group. An egalitarian society, which is what we often say that we're striving for in sort of modern societies, an egalitarian society would be a society where men and women have equal power and benefits. We're certainly not there yet, and I'll show you some examples here. So for example, why do we still see patriarchy, or how do we still see patriarchy in the United States today? Well, I will say, y'all are aware of this, and certainly as you look through your classes, and for those of you who've come to campus, you certainly see this. One of the areas where we see women doing best on, or gaining more power on, is in the area of education. So, in fact, today, if we look around, we see that women are actually, there's more women in college than there are men. So, that's one of those areas that actually shows some very positive changes as far as women in the long term gaining power in society. And if you can look, this actually breaks it down based upon jobs. You can look back in the 1970s, for example, and you'd see in the medical field or in the law field, lawyers, of course, less than 10% of those graduating were women. Nowadays, we've gotten to that 50% point, right around that 50% point, which is a really good sign. It means that these things are more open towards women, to women and men today. So that's sort of an egalitarian idea. However, we still see some big imbalances between men and women, and that's where the patriarchy comes in. For example, in politics, and I've opened this up for you just so you can see this. So this is the percentage of women in their government, and we're looking at sort of what we would call the House of Representatives, Congress, House of Representatives, and the Senate. And so ideally, you'd like to see somewhere around 50% would mean that your society was doing pretty well as far as equal representation, at least. And if you look, you can see that there are some countries that are doing pretty well up here. And I'm not going to go through, we don't have time to go through why you see it in some countries and why you don't in other countries. But I do want to show you where the United States falls on here. So I'm going to try to scroll through here, and hopefully I see it. This is a constantly updating thing, so I'll tell you we're not in great shape. Oh, there we are. So you can see the United States is actually tied in this 80th position, and you can see that women representatives in the Senate, there's 20 women out of 100 people, so we're at about 20% of our senators are women. And in the House of Representatives, it's 79 out of 431, so about 18%. So we're in that 18-19% range of the representatives in the national level are women. Well, that really does matter because, of course, it's the people in these two bodies that make the laws that govern this land. So laws, for example, on things that people care about. For example, daycare, or how daycares will operate, or what kind of licenses you need, or how are we going to pay for these positions, those sort of things. One thing you'll notice is because the United States does not rank so well, you'll see that we tend not to do as well as these countries at the top on a lot of family-friendly policies like having leave after having a child. So in many of these countries here at the top, for example, both men and women get significant time off work after a child is born, and oftentimes that's paid. Really, in the United States, that tends to be, at least the pay part, tends to be up to the discretion of the employer. So it really does make a difference when you start looking at representation as far as what happens to both men and women. So that's one, and of course the one that people oftentimes think about is this notion of the pay gap. One thing that we see amongst men and women is that women earn less than men do, really no matter the job. So oftentimes women's jobs that were seen as women's jobs, things like teaching and other jobs, often paid a lot less than the equivalent jobs that men were taking. So women's work, it was seen as less important than men's work. And so what we still see even today, and this is even when men and women have the exact same job, as both are doctors or both belong to the same field, there's still this gap. So women tend to get paid less than men. Overall, women get paid less than men, and it's somewhere around, women earn about 77% of what men earn. So there is really still this gap existing, and this gap's been around, of course, for a very long time. In fact, one of the problems is we don't really see it closing much anymore. Seems to be kind of stuck at that spot. Another problem that relates to the job market is something that we call the glass ceiling. In many corporations, many businesses, and many places where people work, you'll find that women are of course represented at sort of the bottom levels, but as you move up the ranks, you'll find that the top jobs become more and more male as you go along, and it's very hard for women to sort of break into that very top level. So women may get promoted, they may get jobs, they may get promoted a few times, but then when you start to try to crack into that sort of top level of management, oftentimes you'll find that women have been closed out. So it's called a glass ceiling because you don't really see it until you hit it. Famously, Walmart was there was a class action lawsuit against Walmart because Walmart, of course, majority of their employees were women. If you walk into the store, but they had very few women at the top. So that's something you can pay attention to. You can kind of Google it and see what was going there. But the idea here, though, of a glass ceiling is that it's a limitation of how far you can move up. So, one of the things that I want to sort of look at here is this notion of gender stereotypes. So gender stereotypes are just these basic ideas. And remember, a stereotype is a type of prejudice. But these oversimplified thoughts that people have about people because they belong to a certain group. And so a gender stereotype are these ones, these ideas that men are this way, women are this way, all men are this way, all women are this way. And in part of this, these, of course, gender stereotypes come from that gender socialization I was talking about, this idea that we are taught a certain way from our really from the day we're born to be a certain way if we are male or female. Now, one of the interesting things in modern society is we do start to see a little more flexibility. So, for example, you go back 50, 60 years, it wasn't appropriate for women to be involved in any sort of sporting or athletic ability events in the United States. It just wasn't their place, and of course now we've seen that that's changed. But we still have a lot of these gender stereotypes, and people tend to believe a lot of these gender stereotypes. But these gender stereotypes come from how people were trained over time to think a certain way and in some ways to act a certain ways. So we see this also in this idea of gender roles, and gender roles are just the tasks and activities a culture assigns to the sexes. So in other words, what's appropriate for you to do because you're male, and what is appropriate for you to do because you're a female. And so if you take a look here, this actually came from a children's book in the 70s. You can see the messages it's sending to children. Well, boys are football players, girls are cheerleaders, right? Boys are pilots, girls are stewardesses. Now, some of this, of course, have changed. Now it's flight attendants. And so there's some diversity, but of course, still many people tend to think that, yes, this is how it should be. You should fall into a certain category. You should fall into this category if you're a girl, this category if you're a boy. And so, there's been some changes, certainly, more flexibility, but in many ways, a lot of these still exist. One thing I wanted to mention, kind of really, in some ways, kind of wrapping this up here, this sort of basic introduction, is that one of the ways that we still see that patriarchy, that is men as a group having more power, is oftentimes the things that we associate that are really the exact same thing. If it belongs to a male, it's seen more as a positive, and if it belongs to a female, it's seen more as a negative. So, for example, a man might be firm, but if a woman has that same quality, she will be seen as stubborn, perhaps. A man might be careful about details, but if a woman has that same quality, she might be seen as picky. He's honest, but she's opinionated. He's raising good points, but she's bitchy, right? So this is something where why you see this come about, or why people react this way, is because it's the notion that people are breaking those gender roles of what's expected of them. Right? These are the old-fashioned way. Women weren't supposed to be opinionated. They weren't supposed to have ideas of their own, those sort of things. So, things have changed, but of course things are also the same in many ways. So, that's just a basic introduction to sex and gender. Of course, read the chapter. Most of the material for the quizzes and such will come from the chapter, but hopefully this got you thinking a little bit. And as always, be sure to check out all of the additional materials in the materials folder. And once again, have a great lesson and a great week.